In today's episode, I interview an individual that shares with us a rather unexplored neurological phenomenon called synesthesia. Those experiencing synesthesia undergo multiple sensory stimulation from one incoming source of information, or basically when one sensory pathway, such as sight, triggers another sense, like smell, both at the same time. There are several different types of this condition, such as chromesthesia, whereby colors are triggered and perceived when musical notes are heard, and spatial sequence synesthesia, where they tend to see ordinal sequences physically as points in space, and so on. Today we have on air a synesthete who will be discussing her first-hand experience with grapheme color and spatial sequence synesthesia. I'm so excited to have you with me here today. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, so, not very long ago, I was scrolling around on Reddit and I just went down this rabbit hole. I think I was in I Am a subreddit, and I came across synesthesia. I think that might be correctly pronounced. And I was like, what on earth is this? And then I just went down this rabbit hole. I figured this would be a really good addition to have on my podcast because it's so underspoken, under-talked about, but it's something that people should definitely know about. So can you tell us a little bit about what is synesthesia?
Well, synesthesia, as I understand it, I think it comes from the Greek. I can't provide you an exact translation because it's been a while since I did anything to do with Greek. But it's basically like a combination of the senses. Essentially, so what I have is specifically colour-grapheme synesthesia. So colours are associated with letters, numbers, words. I also have a slight thing to do with spatial sequence synesthesia as well. Others will experience it in terms of more specifically colours and sounds, maybe tastes and sounds. It's not always to do with colour. So some people can taste music. Yeah, colours and sounds is quite a common one. Or shapes and numbers. So a lot of people that are, well, maybe not a lot, but there hasn't really been a lot of research done into it, so I can't give you a figure. But it's fairly common, probably. Maybe not, I don't know. But people that are really good at maths, mathematical geniuses, maybe without even realising it. But I've heard that so they'll associate a number with a shape. And so when you do addition or division or multiplication or whatever, they'll see it in their head as a combination of those shapes joining together. And that will create the end result, which I think is pretty cool. I've never experienced that myself, so I don't know how it works. But it sounds useful, if a bit complicated. But yeah.
It's like geometric shapes almost, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's just so interesting to me. For a person who does not have this or has never experienced this, or at least I don't think I have, it's as far as I can really go. It's just so hard for me to wrap my head around this concept. What exactly do you mean when you say that colors are associated with letters?
Well, it's something that's always quite hard to explain, especially when, as you say, you're someone that doesn't experience that. It's I can read a book and I will see the words written as they are and exactly whatever colour, whatever font they are. But in my head, if I think about it, I know that the letter A is green. The letter R is red. So if I start off by telling someone the letter R is red, you could just assume that, oh, the colour red is R, so maybe that's what you think it is. But I mean, I is white, not indigo. A is green, not azure. So I don't think it's connected to that. That's just how my brain thinks it is. So it's sort of a mind's eye type situation, I think.
Yeah, mind's eye. I think that was something that I wanted to also ask. So it's not something that you see. It's not like a colorblind situation, or it's not something that you can, see with your eye. It's in your mind.
No, I've done colorblind tests before, like professional colorblind tests, and I'm not colorblind. I have the exact amount of color perception that most people will have. I've got normal eyesight as well, so it's not a physical thing.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that distracting when you're trying to read something?
Sometimes it's not so distracting when I'm reading that's like a text that's just in black and white. But if I'm reading like a poster or something where letters are all in color and I'm reading it and I'm like, yeah, but you've picked the wrong colors.
Right.
Like I can understand sometimes why they'll pick a color because like there's a color scheme. Like maybe if it's like, I don't know, an LGBT poster and they're using colors of a rainbow. Yeah, I can understand why they've picked that, but also it just feels wrong because they're just the wrong colors for those letters.
That's so interesting. Would you say that all synesthetes or synesthetes see the same letters in the same colors?
I don't think so. I mean, I've not really, I've spoken to, I remember my classmates when I was in year nine, so when I was 14-ish.
Hmm.
A couple of them said they had synesthesia as well, and I remember having a conversation with them about what colours things were, and they had different answers. So I think someone said A was black, whereas I see it as green. The idea that A would be black just sounds, I don't know, it's not black, not the way I see it. So other people will see it differently, and I imagine it's much the same for people that have like the music type of synesthesia. Some people will hear like the notes, I don't know, E6 as a vivid orange, whereas others will see it as more pink or something.
Right,
But I think it's very much like a personal thing. It just varies.
right. And what about letters and words then? So if you see red, like the letter R is red, so if R is in a word, would that letter be red and all each letter would be a different color, or would a word be one color?
I think words have their own colours. They're harder to see, they're less vivid in my mind. They're more of like a muted colour.
Interesting.
But I don't think it really sometimes if it's like a name, so like if someone's name begins with the letter R, their name will generally have more of a reddish hue to it. And like country names, like for example, England, I would say is slightly more orangish. But it's also got a bit of gold in there for G,
Oh,
but none of the other letters in it really impact it. So I'm not really sure what decides the colour of the words, but it is very much a variance on each word and what type of word they are and the context of the word.
have you ever tried to look for like a pattern to be able to try to understand why is it some words have like are they maybe organized by theme? It like is it categorized by like a theme or as you mentioned like a name or certain feelings or triggered by certain emotions? Have you like put them together and be like, okay, so all of these words have like a reddish hue and maybe you saw a commonality where it has the R in it, but then there are other words that have an R and have no reddish hue. So, like, to try to organize it to understand it a little bit better.
I mean, I think it's probably something to do with like my favorite letters, which sounds a bit ridiculous, but I mean, like R is definitely my favorite letter, and red is my favorite color, and red is my favorite color because R is my favorite letter, and vice versa. So when R is present, it generally has it sort of dominates the other letters a bit. But it's also with names, I think it's very much because of initials. So for example, I use my initials a lot. So the first letters of the names are always the ones that are most commonly used. So they will dominate it very much. And then so with like pronouns or words where the first letter is capitalized, I think it's the same thing because the capital letter just appears more dominant in my head, if that makes sense. And then also I do think it is slightly thematic context as well. So anything that's like sort of military based, for example, so like war, soldier, weapon, even though they all start with different letters, they've all got a slightly kind of khaki-ish hue.
Hmm. That's interesting. Is that a color you like, and do you associate it with something you like or dislike?
Do you mean like khaki specifically?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd say it's more sort of khaki is a traditional sort of military color. So it's quite a decent color. I don't really think about khaki very often, but if you look at like military uniforms, especially like in the past, so nowadays they use more like camouflage patterns. So like multi-terrain pattern, whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but in the past, like World War One, World War Two, you'd often see those uniforms in like war films or whatever. And they're often using this kind of shade of green, kind of khaki. So that's the kind of colour that's associated with the army a lot, especially like the British Army. So I guess that's probably where it comes from.
Yeah. That's interesting. Like it's also like making me go back to think about what you said earlier as well about how like, you know, certain words you actually have some kind of an emotion or opinion about because of the color that it represents to you. Whereas to the average person, maybe a certain word has no particular emotion attached to it. So I don't know, like the word table doesn't mean anything or trigger any kind of response. But I wonder whether because there is a certain color to it, if the word table, for example, had a really ugly color in your head, would it just be a word that you find icky? And again, a word that doesn't have any emotion to it, but has meaning for you simply because of color.
I'd say cable is quite a kind of greyish colour, and I actually quite like the colour grey.
Huh.
So I actually quite like the word cable,
Right.
even though, as you say, it's a completely, I mean, cable is literally just a bit of wire, really. It has absolutely no emotional attachment to it,
Right.
but it's still quite a nice word.
That's so interesting. So you mentioned that for you, it's not something that has particularly been a distraction or gotten in the way of things. Again, this may be through people you've spoken to. You know, I'm sure you've reached out to people because you've noticed that you have it. So for those individuals, can it be something really distracting or destructive from in a person's life? For example, you know, you mentioned before music, having a taste or having a visual color. And so imagine a person just walking on the street or they're driving in the car and there's like music blasting next to them. And would that affect their vision or necessarily potentially pose a risk to them?
I could say it could definitely be distracting, especially if it's something like where you can taste or smell the sound or the word or whatever, because that's much more of a sort of it's a visceral reaction, being able to taste or smell something. So I'd say that's probably more distracting than just associating a color with something.
Right.
Well, it does depend because I think there's probably different levels of synesthesia. So, for example, mine is very much just in my head. It doesn't really affect me at all unless I want it to. Someone that can sort of like see colors and music, I'd say that's probably very much like a levels kind of thing. So they may only hear it with specific types of music, or they may hear it or see it rather all the time. And so every single sound they hear, they might kind of register a color, but I don't experience that, so I'm not sure in what form it would take. But I'd imagine that would be very much sort of a mind's eye type thing. But I could see it being problematic if you're sort of like zoned out, if you know what I mean. Like you're not really paying attention, and then there's this sound, and you're like, oh, that's a nice color, and
Mm-hmm.
then you realize like, oh wait, what am I meant to be doing again? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I could see that being distracting.
You mentioned that it was like a different level. So it's kind of like a spectrum.
Yeah, I would say spectrum is probably an accurate way of describing it.
That is so interesting. There's so many people around the world and more stories coming out of people that are experiencing this. I think also now that we have social media, people have a platform to be able to share this. But is this something that has been scientifically proven or medically proven? And how?
I mean, it's very hard to test for it. So I have seen a couple of like online synesthesia tests, which I've attempted to do. So one thing that you can do is, for example, this test that I tried the other week. So I don't remember the website. Something like synesthesia.com or something. But essentially, you have a color wheel and you get given a letter, and then it like times you on how quickly you are able to select the color that you think it should be. And it does the same for sounds. And it also gives you an option like there is no color associated with this. And then as you keep going, it brings back letters and sounds. So it kind of measures how close the color you select was to your original color that you selected. So measuring the degree of accuracy that you showed.
Wow.
So when I did it, it put me somewhere. somewhere near the top 90%, I think. So that's one way to test it. Another way that I don't think has really been explored very much, but personally, I study psychology. So if I were to ever do some kind of research into it, I would very much be in favor of using like MRI machines or CAT scans, whatever, to be able to see like I think if you have a control person, someone that has no signs of synesthesia, someone that does, you show them the same tests, ask them the same questions, and see what the different reactions in their brain would be. I think that would be a really interesting study to do.
Yeah.
It may already have been done, but I think that could be really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting though, because like to me, it is a gift. It is a gift to have, especially if it is something that we can control, turn on and off. To be able to, I don't know, like taste colors or taste music or see things in certain ways. I feel like it's almost like unlocking a part of your brain, and it's like all these things that we talk about, all these wonders that the universe has, a time space continuum and all of that. It's like to an extent you guys can experience it in this day and on earth. So if this is one of those kind of opening of the brain where you can access certain things, why isn't it something that scientists are trying to research more aggressively and find ways that more people can unlock that part or access that part of their brain?
I mean, synesthesia is very much about sensory input, which is controlled by the thalamus in the brain. So I think it's perfectly possible that people that do experience synesthesia probably do have slightly more access to regions of the thalamus than other people may. Because I mean, every kind of like neurological processing and every kind of neurological disorder or whatever you want to call it is controlled by a region of the brain. And it's like some of them it's sort of like hormonal, chemical, physical even. So I'd say it's definitely something to do with synesthetes having more sort of, I wouldn't say control, because can you really control like a part of your brain? I don't know. It depends how you define control, I guess. But it's definitely, it might be to do with like the thalamus in someone with synesthesia is slightly enlarged, or I'm not really sure. Again, this is why I think like MRI scans would be so interesting. So you could compare things like the thalamus, the link between the thalamus and the cerebral cortex, to someone that doesn't experience any synesthetic tendencies.
I mean, in the same sort of respect or in the same vein, as we talked about, there are individuals that are distracted by it or could potentially be hindered by it. So there is also a need for individuals that may actually want to stop that side if they can't have that kind of level of control, or if they're a little bit more on the stronger side of the spectrum, and it's actually a distraction. Like it could be there could through these MRIs and these testing maybe come up or find medication to be able to control that or stop that effect if it is a problem. So
I mean, exactly. Pretty much every sort of neurological condition, psychological condition that we know about, there is some form of treatment, and there has been for a while. I mean, back in like I don't know, the early 1900s, mid 1900s, they were doing like lobotomies. I can't actually remember what they were intended to solve. I think they were generally basically any kind of mental health problem. They'd perform a lobotomy. But now it's sort of more advanced, as you say, there's medication you can take. Brain surgery is a more invasive and more extreme solution, but generally it will be medication or maybe therapy. You could probably use some kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy potentially if it was something that was distracting to your everyday life. Like I say, if it is something that is like controlled by the size of the thalamus, or you could probably, there would probably be some medication out there. It might not exist now, but I'm sure someone eventually will come up with something that could potentially reduce the size of the thalamus. As I'm not remotely like a chemist, so I have no idea how you would do that, but someone somewhere
Yeah.
would. So it's definitely something that solutions could be found to if it was a problem.
For sure. Yeah. So I want to go on a little bit into your story. Do you remember when and how did you find out that you had this?
It was when I was quite young, so about 4, 5, 6-ish. So basically, I was coloring in like some sort of coloring book. I don't remember what it was about, but there were some letters that needed coloring in, and so I colored them in exactly as I thought those letters should be colored. I think one of the words was great. So I made the G gold, the R red, the E orange, the A green, and the T yellow. And then obviously I showed it to my mum to be like, "Hey, look what I've done! Isn't this cool?" And she looked at it and was like, "Oh, nicely done. Yep, very good. Why have you picked those colours for the letters?" And so I just went, "What do you mean? Why have I picked those colours? That's the colours the letters should be." And so she was like, "Interesting." And then sort of did a bit of research and told me a bit later, "Oh, I think you've got synesthesia." And I was like, "What's synesthesia?" And then I remember in primary school when I was probably around 10-ish, I remember the headmistress referencing it again. I can't remember how it came up with her, but she used to teach music and Latin as well. And she, for some reason, always made a big thing about it in the lessons, even though, as I say, I'm not a musical synesthete. It really had no relevance whatsoever. But she would bring up a big thing about it whenever it was remotely relevant to the lesson. And so that just kind of hearing it being talked about by her and the other students in the class not really knowing what was going on sort of made me look into it more as I got older. And so the more I sort of researched what like synesthesia was, eventually I was able to put a name to the type that I experience most commonly, which is colour-grapheme synesthesia. And I was like, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So you've basically had it all along. And, the moment you were able to sort of express yourself, it was like one of the first things that you did, which is pretty cool.
Mm.
Yeah.
I'd say there's probably quite a few people out there who experience it, but they just don't really think about it because I mean, I would never have thought any more about it if my mum hadn't been like, "Why have you picked those colours?" And then acted surprised when I said, "Well, that's the colour that those letters should have."
Right.
If she'd also been like, if she'd also had the same kind of synesthesia and been like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense,"
Yeah.
I would have just thought nothing of it and thought it was completely normal. But because she was so surprised by it, I was like, "Well, apparently this isn't normal then."
Right. And also in the same way, I think because you were so young, it could have easily gone the other way where, you told her, oh, this is how it's supposed to be. And, it would just be ignored like, okay, yeah, she's a kid. She's probably going through a phase, like whatever, and not really taking it serious. But, the fact that she also kind of turned around and said, okay, let's read about this. Like, let's take her word for it and, look it up and actually like help you in terms of like finding the name for it as well is kind of cool because you could, I don't know, maybe potentially go through your whole life, maybe never even knowing that you're a synesthete if the conversation is never brought up or, if there's no opportunity for it.
Exactly, because it's not really, as I say, it's not something that's really gets discussed a lot. It's not like, for example, it never really, I mean, I haven't watched an awful lot of TV, but I've never seen it given a lot of representation in TV or films or anything really. So it's not like something like color blindness, everyone knows that exists, but synesthesia is slightly less talked about. I mean, there have been cases of sort of like celebrities who have like demonstrated tendencies. I've seen like I think Taylor Swift supposedly has the type where color is associated with music. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's probably the case with a lot of like people that are like, what do you call it, pitch perfect.
Mm.
Because I mean, for me, I am completely tone deaf. I've no idea what a note is. If you play a note, I'll be like, yeah, that's a music note. I don't know any more about it.
Right.
But if I could see colours associated with each note, it would be much easier to be like, oh yeah, that's an F sharp, a minor key or whatever, because I'd be
Right.
able to see the specific color of it. So, I mean, there's probably, I might be wrong because, as I say, I know nothing about music whatsoever. But it's perfectly possible that a lot of people that are pitch perfect, like, what's his name? Charlie Puth,
Oh yeah, yeah.
is like perfectly pitch perfect. He
Uh-huh.
might have it as well. Taylor Swift is pitch perfect as well, I'm pretty sure. And she does apparently have it. So I
Wow.
think that would explain that.
That's interesting. So you think that they use like their colors maybe to drive their creativity or to help them compose their music to an extent? Like if the colors make sense to them, then the music kind of makes sense as well. Do you think that that's possible?
Because it kind of vivifies it, really. If you can combine the two senses together and you can hear the music and you're not just hearing the sound, you're also seeing the music.
Right,
It makes it more of an experience for you.
right.
So I'd imagine someone with that kind of synesthesia will be much more creative because they'll be much more driven to experience that. For me, music is just music. It's nice to listen to, but I can't write it, and I don't really have any interest in writing it.
Yeah,
If
fair
I
enough.
could see the colors of the notes, it'd be much more like, this is so fun. I
Yeah.
want to do this more.
That's making me think a little bit about like Beethoven and, in his time, he was, I think he was deaf. He couldn't hear, but yet he was a music composer. And yeah, I wonder, apparently he was using like math to compose his music, but I do wonder whether, he was able to see numbers with, with music notes or something and was able to like create such wonders, even though he was not able to actually hear. Again, being a perfect composer using geometry and numbers.
I mean, like I said earlier, there's a kind of geometric synesthesia where numbers have shapes. So it might have been a combination of that as well, which would explain a lot because, as you say, being able to compose music while you can't actually hear it just sounds impossible
Yeah.
to the vast majority of people out there. So it's an incredibly impressive feat, but it would explain a lot if he had some kind of synesthesia as well, which he probably wouldn't have realized it because, I mean, during Beethoven's time, I highly doubt anyone was really discussing it.
Yeah, definitely. So, what about for you though? Do you feel like you have been able to use your color grapheme synesthesia in a creative way, or have you been able to allow the colors to drive you and maybe your writing? Like, have you invested some time in like poetry writing, like any kind of creative writing using colors?
And surprisingly enough, I actually have, yes. English was always sort of one of my strongest subjects all through school, right the way. I mean, I didn't take it past 16, and I'm obviously not doing it at university now either. But English language, so like creative writing, poetry writing, anytime I got to do some writing that was just of my own, I've always enjoyed that. And it does extend to as well to like when I have to write essays or research reports or whatever. It's like, and spelling as well. So I won a whole school spelling competition once. And it's spelling is just something that sort of it comes naturally. It's like, well, it has to be that letter.
Right.
I always kind of assumed it was just because I've got a good vocabulary, so I can see like patterns in words. But then again, English is such a weird language. There are so many patterns that just don't apply. So it could be something to do with the synesthesia, like that I don't consciously process. It's a subconscious thing where I'm like, well, we've had these four letters and the rest of the word sounds like this, but it has to go like that. And
Mm.
then in the same way, writing an essay or a poem or a story or whatever, it has to go like this because it flows better. Like it's hard to really sort of verbalize it. But yeah, I think that could explain quite a lot.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I guess that you have like a really vivid memory and a vivid learning style, or rather like a visual learning style because of that.
Yeah. I call it like a photographic memory or an eidetic memory in the sense of like there's never been proven to be such a thing as a truly photographic memory. But the way I would describe my memory as photographic, not in the sense of it's perfect, I remember everything I've ever learned, ever, but in the sense of I do remember things very visually, sort of photographically, videographically, even. And I can remember them from my earliest memories, probably from the age of 2. and I can remember it like I am literally right there.
Wow.
And I can remember it exactly sort of like what I was feeling, the context, the color of the room that I was in. I can't remember exactly what people were wearing, but I can generally remember the kind of the color of what they were wearing. So colors in memory very much stand out. I remember it being a thing that always used to sort of impress my parents slightly when I was younger, because I'd be like, hey, remember when we took the train to London and it was a really cloudy day? And they'd be like, how do you remember it was a cloudy day? We were in a train. I'm like, yeah, but it was cloudy. I know it was cloudy. And I mean, obviously, I can't prove that it was cloudy while we were on the train to London in like 2010, but I'm 100% sure it was cloudy.
Wow. Yeah, that's so interesting. I wish I could have that kind of memory, but I also wonder whether like we humans are created without that ability to remember such vivid details for a reason.
I mean, potentially, I'd say it's also probably something that could be problematic because, like I say, major events and minor events, I can remember them all with the same vivid detail. So anything that would be classed as like, I don't know, like a traumatic memory, I will remember that in the exact same kind of detail as I would something completely innocuous. So I'd say in that sense, you could call it like more of a curse than a gift.
Hmm.
But regardless, I don't think I would be able to experience life the same way if I knew that I wasn't going to be able to remember what I was doing. Because it's nice to be able to do something and be like, in 10 years, I remember this like it was yesterday. It's quite cool.
Yeah. That's so crazy because I didn't know that the brain even had that ability. I mean, this is really going back to I think I remember reading this book this one time where they were talking about how like the computer is a simulation of our brain. We have created the computer folders and files and all of these kind of organizational systems to replicate the way that our brain works. And that's why it became so widespread and people were so easy to understand how to use it and utilize it, simply making a folder to organize our thoughts. And in a sense, our brain works that way too. However, there is also a level of space, and eventually it does need to sort of be cleaned up. But our brain doesn't quite work that way. It just keeps storing more and more information, right? So, yeah, like the overload, I can imagine. Maybe this is why our brains generally tend to at a distance. The further away a memory is, the less we tend to remember of it, because that's the brain's way of naturally just like flushing out the things and refreshing itself. Whereas for you, yeah, like how that can just be piled on and it be just a lot, right?
Exactly, because I mean, I've got around, I don't know, nearly 2 decades of memories. And so as someone that's old will be like, well, you don't really remember much. And I'll be like, well, realistically, I probably have as many memories as you do because you will remember fewer events than I do. Because I've spoken to a lot of people because I think, well, I've always kind of assumed, oh, it's pretty normal to be able to remember that much detail from like growing up. And even if they're the same age, they'll be like, yeah, no, I don't remember my fifth birthday actually. And I'm like, what? You don't? It wasn't that long ago. So realistically, even though there's less time for me to have memories of there's someone who's like, I don't know, 35, I'll still probably have the same number of memories. So it's quite interesting, really, but I don't know why that is. Again, it's probably something to do with like my specific brain makeup. Yeah, the hippocampus. So, for example, so taxi drivers in a big city like London or New York City, the studies have been done which show they have a much larger hippocampus region because they have an almost photographic memory of the map of that city because they've driven it so many times. They know the routes to pretty much anywhere within that city, even though it's absolutely massive. And so that means they've got a much larger hippocampus than the average person.
Right. So it is something that you can potentially like train. I mean, of course, this is slightly different from what you're talking about, but for a driver can develop this skill and actually exercise that muscle in the brain to enlarge it, physically enlarge it for them to be able to simply do their job, right? In the same way,
Exactly.
yeah, and in the same way, I know that there are certain languages that allow people to express themselves a certain way or see the world a certain way, perceive the world a certain way, simply just by the mere fact that their language has the ability to, has the words for certain things. Like, I think in Japanese, there is a word for an emotion that doesn't exist in English language, which is, I think, which derived from post-World War II. There was just so much pain going around in Japan that there is a word to describe this deep-seated anger or anguish. And in a sense, I think there has been research to show that in Japan, people are able to access a level of an emotion simply because they have the language for it. I wonder as well whether with synesthesia, it is something that you can, I don't know, massage a part of a brain, exercise a part of a brain to be able to access.
I mean, for something like memory is something that everyone experiences. So it's easy to be like, well, do these memory training skills. Like every day, spend 10 minutes of memorizing something. Or like, for example, if you're studying for an exam, most people will probably spend an hour or a couple of hours a day in the weeks or months leading up to that exam, going over it and basically training their brain to remember that. So because it's something everyone experiences, like the act of memorization, it's easier to explain how to train that. But because not everyone experiences synesthesia, it's hard to make that a concept that everyone can grasp in a way to train it. So I'd say that would be something that would be harder for someone to train themselves to do. Like I said, if it's something that is controlled by like the thalamus or whatever, the size of the thalamus, you could potentially increase the size of someone's thalamus in order to give them the capacity to experience it. But if they have no prior knowledge or understanding of that experience, I think it would be quite hard to train them into having it.
Interesting. I wanted to ask you actually one more last question before we move into the second part of synesthesia that you have recently discovered. When it comes to things like color coding, using highlighters, organizing your information, say if you're studying and you wanted to highlight certain things or create or make notes for yourself, is that different for you? Is that process different for you? Do you write certain words by color? How does that work for you?
I mean, the only real thing that I've noticed that's particularly different from my note taking to most people is I make notes on paper, so I will handwrite my notes, whereas the vast majority of people in my lectures will take notes via laptop. I don't like doing that, but whether that's something to do with synesthesia, I'm not sure. I've just always found, so like when I used to do plays, for example, in primary school, if I had like a particularly long speech to memorize, I would always find it more helpful if I wrote it out. Because like I said with the diary thing, once I've written it, I then have a memory of writing it. So it creates two memories of it. So if I write something, I'm more easily able to remember it. And I also just really like my handwriting. So it's nice to see my handwriting more often.
That's awesome.
I'm not particularly very organized at studying. I don't particularly like studying. So why on earth I picked to do a 4-year degree? I don't know. But it's something that I've never really done a lot of revision. I just kind of rely on having a good memory, and I'll make notes on what I think is interesting from a lecture, and I'll just write that down in kind of literally just black pen. Sometimes I'll highlight something in, I don't know, whatever color highlighter I have to hand. But I don't really color code so much. It's something that I can see the value of it, and I probably would benefit from doing that. Potentially, like having synesthesia would make it more of a benefit to me than it would to other people.
Yeah.
But I just generally can't be bothered to do it because I don't need to do it.
Yeah, that's true. And what about in terms of like, for example, like going to a library, and you're just seeing like words and books everywhere and it's organized by like alphabetically, but the colors could just potentially be like all over the place for you. And
I absolutely hate it when the colors are just not in a wrong order. I hate it.
Right. So it must be like, in a sense, it must be such a mess of a place for you when you go there because you're just like, yeah, I see why you have organized the books this way. However, for me, it's just such a blur. It's just such a mess right now. Like you just want to sit down and reorganize it all so that it's like got this really nice, clean spectrum of colors, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have in my room at home, I have three bookcases full of books, and they're organized in. So if I've got like a series of books, they'll be organized in the series, and then if they're unconnected, I will organize them to make the colors sort of match.
That's so cool.
Because it looks neater.
Yeah.
I don't like it when you've just got random colors everywhere that have no relation to each other.
Right.
It's just so much more chaotic, it's interesting that it's like that because the rest of my room is very much a mess. But it's a controlled mess. I know where things are, but it's a mess regardless. Yeah. But when it comes to having something because pretty much every book will have like the spine of it is coloured.
Right.
And it just has to be like, I don't know, I never really know what order. I can't tell you like, I think it's more of like the colours have to flow into each other.
Right.
Having like a blue next to a red or something just doesn't match unless the colour on the other side of the blue or the red matches and they can kind of create a pattern or something.
Right. That's really funny. So I imagine like for any average person coming into your room, maybe like looking at your bookshelf going, you know what, like the books are not from tall to short, big, wide to thin, or, it's not organized in a way that sort of looks necessarily aesthetically pleasing. But however, to you, it makes the most sense. So,
I mean, if I could organize it in a way so it's perfect height order, width order, and color order, that would be perfect. But if I could control exactly how something's published and then have it perfect order, that would be perfect. But sadly, I don't.
Yeah.
So the color order is the most important one.
Yeah.
And that's the one I prioritize.
Do you also pick your books based on the colors?
Not really. I mean, I'd say I'd be more likely to buy a book if it was red. Like if the dominant color in the cover of it was red. But it's also whether I'm actually interested in having that book. So it's not the main factor that I would consider.
Yeah. Probably like the only time where a non-synesthete, if that's what we call it, could experience anything remotely close to this is like, I don't know, taking some kind of hallucinogen, like a drug that can unlock that part of the brain. I'm curious, have you ever tried any kind of hallucinogen or like, what would that kind of have an effect for you? Do you think that would highlight those colors even more, or would it potentially look totally different to you?
I mean, I've never taken drugs of any kind, and I don't think I will at any point in the near future because I am subject to random drug tests, so it just wouldn't really be a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
But taking something like LSD or ecstasy, I think would be really fascinating because from what I've heard of it, it's very much sort of a very visual experience. So you'll have like colours merging into each other or whatever. And I think for someone with like a specifically colour orientated form of synesthesia, it would be a very much more vivid experience, possibly more of a physical experience than someone without. But even someone without synesthesia will still have the same like basic form of experience. So I'd say that probably could be a way to like explain it to someone.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'd definitely probably go back and do a little bit of reading about that as well to see, because I can imagine the two go hand in hand quite a lot, and that experience be, either really enhancing for the individual or maybe even confusing, if at the end of the day they come out of that experience going, you know what, that wasn't exactly quite the way I see it, in sobriety.
Yeah, I could see that being very frustrating if you're seeing colours and you're like, yeah, but those colours don't belong there.
Exactly.
It can turn it into more of like, sort of, what do you call it, like a bad trip?
Yeah, definitely. For sure. So I want to talk a little bit about the second form or type of synesthesia that you told me about that you've more recently discovered. I was like reading a little bit about that. I don't know whether it would be called like spatial sequence synesthesia, time space synesthesia, something along those lines. Do you have a name for this?
I would say probably like spatial, time spatial sounds like I don't know whether that's the accepted definite name for it, but it makes sense because basically, so what I experience in that respect is time is like I've told people before that I can see time just because that's like the quickest way to say it. It kind of makes it sound like I'm some kind of psychic or something. I'm not, but I can see like time as kind of like, so in like primary school or elementary school or whatever, you'll start learning about negative and positive numbers. And so you have these number lines. And so for me, time is a bit like a number line where you are is at zero. So zero is the present, and then the future is the positive numbers, and the past is negative numbers. So it's very much that I will see like the future is going to the right of me, and the past goes to the left. And so if you want to describe it more in the sense of the present is constantly moving, I guess it's like a road, which is like a perfectly straight road, and you're in a car moving at a steady speed, and you're going to the right. So if you're stood on like one specific side of the road. For me, I always see it from so if you're stood in the middle of a road, I will always be stood on the right side of the road. And then the car will go to the right for the present and it's leaving everything on the left behind it. So that is how I would view that. It's always like, I mean, if you see a line, you just see a line.
Right.
But for me, it's always like I'm seeing it from the right side of it as opposed to the left.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense. It's hard to explain it, but it's always, I'm seeing the right side of the line. It's going to the right. That's the direction. So therefore, I'm seeing the right side of the line.
Right. So is it like a 3D image, kind of?
Kind of. It's like, I mean, it doesn't really look like a number line in my head. That's just the way I explain it. It's more like, I don't know if you've ever seen like Doctor Who or something, but like the time space continuum or whatever that TARDIS travels through.
Yeah.
It's a bit like that, except it's not all over the place. It's very much straight.
Right. So that for you is always a straight line. It's never something that bends. It's not like a road that bends or meanders or twists and turns. It's got no association with any particular memory or event. If you've had, for example, like a past, like the year 2020 was a bad year for you, it doesn't go down or up for you. It's always just one linear straight line.
Yeah, it's very much straight. I mean, it's a bit like, if you ever studied history, you will at one point have had to draw like a timeline of like, I don't know, a timeline of World War One. So you got the Battle of the Somme in 1916, Treaty of Versailles, 1918, etc. And you'll draw like points up and then write what that is.
Yeah.
So major events will they stand out. They don't alter the shape of a road, but I'll look at the road and be like, oh, okay, so that must have been 2018 because that's the year I changed schools or something.
That's really interesting. When I was again down my Reddit rabbit hole, there were a lot of people who experienced exactly this type of synesthesia, and they were drawing it out just to give a visual to others as to what it kind of looks like for them. And it's very different for different people. Some people see it as it looks like a clock and they're standing in the middle of the clock, and each handle or each point is a month or a year. Some of them see it as like a really complex sort of diagram. So that's interesting. Have you ever tried to draw yours out?
No, not really, because I mean, it's hard to draw it because I mean, I could just draw like a number line or a timeline. But if I show that to anyone, I just want like, okay, so you've just created a timeline of your life. What's interesting about that?
Right.
Because as I said, the way I see it, it's very much like it's a straight, whirling, coalescing series of kind of colors. I say colors, it's not really colors, it's more of shades of the same color. It's kind of like bluey greenish.
Huh. Well, I associate that with like a really calming kind of sense or feeling. Would you say that too?
Uh, Maybe it doesn't really evoke any kind of emotion in me just seeing the timeline. If I like go more deeply and be like, oh, okay, so that's the year that I don't know, that's the year I learned to drive my to learn to like I passed my driving test or something. It'd be more like, oh yeah, good year. But that's more because I know what happened then.
Right.
And that's maybe why I have such a good memory because I can the memories have a physical position in my head. So
Does it look the same if you were to talk about, say, like it by the hour, by the week, by the month, by the year, by the decade? Does it all look the same?
yeah,
Okay.
it's very much how I schedule things.
Right.
Because I know, like, if you tell me, oh yeah, I've got a meeting at 1500, I know where that is in the day because I
Right.
can see the day, and it's like I've got a calendar in my head.
Right. Wow. And that's really cool. So I guess you don't even need to really utilize a physical calendar or the calendar on your phone or anything to schedule things out because you just know.
I mean, I use calendars for the sake of looking like I'm organized, but I don't need them because if you tell me, oh yeah, can we do this thing at 1500? I'll be like, yep, we can do that.
Yeah.
And then I'll just know, oh yeah, I've got this thing to do at 1500.
Right. That's so interesting. Okay, yeah. Why don't you tell me, like, when did you figure this part out? Do you feel like you always had this, or was this triggered by an event or something you just recently discovered?
I'd say I probably always had it, but it was much more sort of subconscious. I didn't really think about it. Because I mean, like I said, I would never have really thought about colour-grapheme synesthesia if it hadn't been pointed out to me. I don't know what it was that made me think about this, but it was just more of a sense of because it's like it's also when I think, I'm very aware of kind of where the thinking is going on. So I can kind of feel the process of thought in my head, like physically. So I'm like, okay, yeah, this is taking place in the exact center of my brain. It may not be, but I mean, the thought occurs in sort of what is it like? I don't know, the cerebral cortex or something, which is, I mean, is that the center? I think it's more towards the front,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I can sort of feel where it's happening. And in the same way, I can feel how time is progressing, but I just never really thought about it.
Right. That's so cool. I mean, like, that's definitely something that we here, Earthlings, would not really quite be able to understand. It's oftentimes when people, the small number of humans that have stepped out of Earth have been able to sort of really understand that concept of this time space continuum, right? Because, I think for us, it's like a philosophy. It's almost taught to us or introduced to us as a philosophy, as a way of thinking. But it's only really when you step out of Earth and into space, into the universe, that you get a glimpse of what that is like. So it's really cool that you can experience that here on your own in its most rawest and natural form without, having to trigger or pull anything apart to make that happen.
Oh, I'd definitely say it's very useful because I mean, like for example, people with ADHD will often have time difficulty keeping track of time. I don't have difficulty keeping track of time because I can see it.
Hmm.
So I'm like, it's not in a sense of that I can exactly measure, oh yeah, so it's been 5 seconds. I will have a vague idea of it's probably been about 30 seconds now, but it won't be exactly that. But I'll be able to know like, oh yeah, I've got this thing to do at 1500. What's the time now? Okay. I will always remember, yeah, thing is happening at 1500. And I'll see that in the day and I'll see my position in the day. And it's sort of more, I don't know, if I was to measure time, it'd be more in the sort of like, more in like measuring it with a ruler or a tape measure rather than with a watch. If I was just measuring it in my head, I will use a watch anyway because like it's a lot more accurate. But in the sense of like remembering something from about 10 years ago, I'll be like, oh yeah, that's 10 miles away
Right.
type thing, which wouldn't make any sense to anybody else. Because about what are you on about?
Yeah.
But that's kind of it's visually how I see it.
Yeah. And again, it's in the most practical sense for you. It's just a part of who you are and a part of your life and a part of your being. for a person who does not have it or never experienced it, it is like a very supernatural sort of power to have. I'm curious as to like, have you ever gone into religion or philosophy or spirituality? Have you ever like tried to like meditate deep and try to like really see that connection, connect with this side of you on a deeper level? When you're reading a philosophical or spiritual kind of text, do you feel like some of it you can actually connect with and relate to on a level that for us is just a belief?
I mean, ironically enough, if I read something spiritual, I'm very much like, well, that's too abstract. Talk actual scientific sense. Because even though I probably experience things in a more abstract way to other people, I still prefer things to be laid out in a scientific way. So, for example, I'm doing psychology right now, which some people will argue, but I think is a science. And so we're currently doing a lot of sort of social behavioral psychology, which is interesting enough, but I want to know the scientific side, so the neurological side, what is actually happening in the brain. And you might have been able to guess that by some of my previous answers, talking specifically about like the thalamus, hippocampus, etc. Because I very much think that it's very much all controlled by biological, chemical, neurological processes that occur within like regions of the brain, hormones, etc. So although I was raised religiously, it's not something that you can physically observe. So I don't really think about it very much, which, as I say, is quite ironic when I also tell you that, yeah, I have colour-grapheme synesthesia and some form of kind of spatial time synesthesia as well, which cannot remotely be expressed in a physical manner to anyone that doesn't explain it.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a conundrum, but I guess that's partly why I'm so interested in the scientific side of psychology, because I would like synesthesia to be able to be expressed in a more scientific manner.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that's a really good way to look at it, especially now that the numbers are, growing and there's more and more people talking about it. And it seems to be, the way that it's always been here in the world is when it's something that we can't explain, it is, we leave it, we chalk it down to it being some kind of mythical, supernatural thing. But then the more people experience it, or the more people come out with it, or the more science is able to prove it, then it does get normalized at some point. So I see kind of like why you'd want to prove this scientifically as well, so you can let people know that, hey, look, it's just normal. It's nothing crazy.
Exactly. And I think on one level, I just want to understand it because it's annoying to me to have something that a lot of other people don't and not be able to explain it and not really know why it happens to me specifically and not to other people. Because I think the brain itself is deeply fascinating because there is so much that we don't know about it and so much that we probably never will know because it's extremely hard to research the brain because you can't really dissect a living brain. You can only dissect like one from someone who's dead, and even that is quite difficult because of like ethical situations and so on. So it's quite possible that we never will have a full scientific definition of synesthesia because it's so much sort of an abstract thing and it's hard to put scientific terms on something that's quite abstract. But at the same time, it occurs in the brain. It's a mental process. So there must be some physical explanation for it.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, again, like if just going back to that, if we are able to experience those things with hallucinogens, with deep meditation, then it must be real to an extent, because it is something that people have experienced that don't necessarily have synesthesia, but have experienced with the help of something, right? With a third stimuli or stimulation or something. So if people, even your regular person, can experience it, even though it might be momentarily or temporarily, it's got to exist. It's got to be something that's legit, right?
Exactly. If it's accessible, then it's understandable. Because it's like, I've very much strongly believe in the motto, if you can get in somewhere, you can get out of it. So, like, if I can get my car in a parking space, I can get out of it.
Right.
So if someone that doesn't experience something like synesthesia can temporarily have the effects of it through some other mechanism, like some kind of hallucinogenic drug, then it must be able to be accessible because it's clearly there in the brain. It's just not easily subconsciously accessible. You need some other material to get yourself to the point where you can experience it.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, that's so interesting. I absolutely cannot wait for our listeners to hear this. It's definitely going to be one of those episodes where a lot of people are going to be asking a lot of questions and wanting to know a little bit more. So, thank you for sharing your experience on this and, everything that you know about it. And yeah, I really, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. It's no problem at all. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
Joe Mills,
Chris Trzynski, Stefan Menzel.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm Jenica, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.